Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on navigating the political landscape for real estate and construction. This is the last of our virtual speaker series for 2022. My name is Mark Cooter, and I'm a tax partner and leader in the real estate and construction practice for Cherry Bekaert. Today, we'll be offering CPE for today's session. So if you are a CPA, you can get CPE credit for today's session. And here's a couple house cleaning items. To receive CPE credit, you must answer at least 3 polling questions and attend for the full 50 minutes. CPE certificates will be issued via email within 10 days. And if you have not received yours after 10 days, please email cbhlearning@cbh.com. A recorded version of this webinar will be available in about 1 week and will be sent via email and posted to our website. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into the Q&A window. Just note that a short survey will be posted right after the webinar, and we ask that you take a little bit of time just to give us some feedback on today's session, as well as offer any other feedback that you would like to give. To start the session off, we're going to launch a poll question to keep you to help you get a free CPE poll question will appear, and it'll give you an idea about what those polling questions will look like. Our first poll is, how did you hear about this webinar? Are you a current client? Did you register through an email from Cherry Bekaert? Are you a friend or colleague, or was it from one of our posts in LinkedIn or social media? We're going to give you about 20 seconds to answer and collect responses. And just a reminder, for CPE, you must answer at least 3 of the 4 poll questions. If you have any issues submitting your answer, please type your responses in the chat box. All right, we'll take a look at the results real quick, and then we'll get started. All right, most people responded that they received an email from Cherry Bekaert, so thanks for that. With that, I'm pleased to introduce our speakers today. Chip Felkel is the CEO of Felkel Group, along with Ron Wainwright, who's a partner with our Cherry Bekaert in our Tax Credits and Incentives Advisory Group. Thank you both for being here today, and we'll kick it off with Chip. Chip, take it away.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning, everyone. 23 shopping days till Christmas, I guess, so keep that in mind. What we'd like to do today is just give you an analysis and assessment of this 22 election cycle, give you some things to think about going forward, and certainly be open to any questions via email or directly as we move forward. Going to give you a lot of stats, some which you may find interesting. I hope so anyway, but hope to be looking through, what just happened in this cycle, and some of the things that we'll be looking at, or what resonated with voters, what didn't, where was the polling in the 2022 cycle. We'll also be looking at issues and events that may have impacted the election, some of which you might not have considered, who impacted the election and why, and who were the winners, who were the losers as it relates to this cycle and what that means going forward. So as we get started, I think it's important to really, when you're dissecting an election cycle, particularly in the environment that we're in 2022, I think it's really important to dig a little bit deeper. I mean, of course, inflation was something that everyone felt would play heavily in the cycle, and 31% of the people that were surveyed indicated that it was a top tier issue for them. No surprise there, and no surprise that the view was that Republicans would be better at handling that. One of the big things that really developed during the summer, of course, was the Dobbs decision, Roe versus Wade. And for 27% of the people that were surveyed, that was their top issue. And one of the things I think is important about that is that I believe that the abortion issue was critically important and greater than people might realize, in that it mobilized a whole segment of voters that were then also looking at other issues into the fall, particularly in like the state of Pennsylvania, where there was a Senate seat up, or 37% of the people there indicated that that was a top issue for them. So it got people engaged, and then they started looking at other issues as well. One of the things that people took to heart, and we found in this election cycle, was candidates' attributes. You know, it wasn't abortion was an issue there, but it was also very important on how people believed in the strength of the candidacy. The strength of candidates played heavily, particularly in the Senate races, whether they were deniers or not, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Certainly the influence of the former president on certain Senate races and gubernatorial races played a heavy role. And the Democrats actually picked up 3 governor seats and only lost 1. And several of those were believed to have been going to the Republicans in this cycle, and have to believe that some of the outside noise and the influences of some of those larger voices, if you will, played a heavy role there. When you look at how people voted and why they voted and whether they voted for something or against something, 33% of those surveyed indicated they voted in opposition to Biden, 28% in opposition to Trump. But then there's something else that affected the election that I think I want to make sure people don't forget. And I believe that's the attack on Pelosi's husband at the end of, right at the end of the cycle, which was something that I think for independent voters may have given them pause in terms of the extremism that they see coming from the right now. You've got to give a lot of credit to young voters in this cycle, particularly voters 18 to 29, about 28% voted. It probably was what made the difference in the Pennsylvania Senate race and the Wisconsin governor's races. And you had your first Generation Z member elected to Congress. And for those of you that aren't familiar with that, that's someone who was born after 1996. Makes us all feel a little bit older. Certainly women played a huge role with abortion rights, and with suburban women particularly. Women make up 52% of our population, but they accounted for 55% of the last presidential vote. 52% of the vote in 2022 was women and 48% men, and 53% of those women suggested that they voted for the Democratic candidates. So inflation was important, but it was a combination of different things. When you look at impacts and votes around the country, look at Florida. DeSantis was the first Republican candidate to win as big as he did in Florida, and of course that sets the stage for a potential presidential run. And he did so in part by winning Miami-Dade, which was the first Republican candidate to win Miami-Dade in 20 years. Remember, that's about a 76% Hispanic vote, mostly Cuban. But transversely, the Democrats won 2 out of 3 really heavy Hispanic districts in South Texas that the Republican Party had targeted. And what that says to me is that while the Latino vote is becoming increasingly more and more important in the United States daily, it's not monolithic. Cuban voters are not the same as Mexican voters or Argentinian or Colombian voters. And that's something that needs to be considered by both parties as they look ahead. You saw a lot of information about Republicans making inroads with Hispanic voters, but that seems to have possibly been primarily focused in South Florida. Independent voters need to be given their due. They made up about 31% of the electorate, and they favored Democrats by Republicans. That's a break. The last 4 midterms, they had voted double digits for the party that was out of power, and that was not the case in 2022. And I go back to how we started in saying that, you know, bad candidates were in part the problem, and those were bad candidates, frankly, that were recruited and supported by the former president. Trump, Oz, we'll see what happens with Walker in Georgia, but and then probably the biggest name that we've seen so far was Kerry Lake in Arizona. Let's talk about polling and the problems with polling. I'd be surprised if everyone on this call did not receive at least one call maybe multiple calls as it relates to polling during this cycle. Polling has gotten very, very difficult. It's harder and harder as people take their landlines out of their homes. Some people are answering from text polls and so forth and responding to that. But they have been reasonably accurate, but they tend to underestimate Republicans in the past couple of cycles, particularly back to 14. But if we see them erring, sometimes that can indicate a fundamental problem. If you look at, traditionally you hear about turnout, and you have Nate Silver at 538 who talks about whether or not polls have been pretty close and underestimated Democrats in 17, 21, and 22 probably, particularly after the Dobbs decision. And if you go back and look at 2018, it was kind of a mixed bag, with some people claiming there's some kind of systematic Democratic bias in pollsters. But Republicans tend to benefit, it seems, from higher turnout only, and you go back to 2016 with this, when Trump is on the ballot, meaning that 16 and 20 might be the wrong elections to really focus on as we're trying to look at these polls and determine what's happening. I will say that if you look at 22, at this cycle, obviously a lot less emphasis on the race in Georgia over the next week. The latest poll shows Warnock up 51 to 47, and early voting in Georgia started on the 28th of this month, excuse me, of November, and there's already a record early turnout there. So there's not as much money and attention there because the Senate's not in play, but my money right now would be on Warnock defeating Walker next week. Could be wrong, but it certainly would indicate that that's where that race is going to go. The slide you're seeing here is just kind of further about underestimating Democratic turnout, and how that's been an issue for both polling and prognosticators and commentators, where voters were undercounted. A lot of times, let's face it, nobody's completely objective. If you hear from as a group based out of Georgia, Trafalgar, that won a lot of national acclaim because they predicted Trump's win, and they were atrociously off this past cycle. Everybody has a bias, everybody has a different approach in how they look at the numbers. But I would suggest if you want to look at good polling data going forward, stick to the ones that have been around for a long time. Stick to Pew, to Edelman, National Opinion Research, as opposed to partisan motivated pollsters who may or may not be doing work for a Democrat or a Republican candidate. Stick to some of the more objective groups. Always look at what they're doing in terms of new and younger voters who have had higher turnout in the last couple of years. That kind of skews some precedents. There's no question that there's so many polls that kind of creates a certain amount of fatigue, and whether people are giving accurate or just off the cuff answers. And then when you're looking at polling, if you're doing this going forward, look and see what their sample size is. If you see a poll that has anything less than 1,000 or less people, discount it, because that's just not a big enough sample to really get a good feel for what the electorate is doing. It's an art, it's not a science, and predictive polling is helpful, but you've got to remember what you're looking at. As we look at the 2022 cycle, there were some losers, I guess, if you want to put it like that. The big thing I think that we've heard a lot about is that revisiting the 2020 election cycle is not necessarily a winner for candidates. You had 370 Republican candidates who denied or questioned the 2022 results. 172 of those won. But also at the same time, 3 out of 4 Republicans who were surveyed coming out of exit polls, one by NBC, all acknowledged that they felt like Biden won the 2020 election. It's not a winning proposition. And the sooner, in my opinion at least, as a longtime Republican operative, is that the party's got to do a better job and move past 2020. Most of those election deniers were defeated soundly, whether it was Benjamin, Arizona, Marchant, Nevada, Mitchell in Wisconsin, even Tudor Dixon in Michigan, who at one point was looked to have a decent shot at upsetting the Michigan governor there, and Mastriano in Pennsylvania. All of those, not only were they defeated, but they conceded, with the exception of Kerry Lake in Arizona, who still seems to be in the process of taking exception to the results. I think the other thing that's important to look at in this is what role did Trump play in the Trump Senate endorsements? He endorsed Oz, he endorsed Laxalt in Nevada, both lost. He endorsed Bolduc in New Hampshire, he lost by 10 points. Of Trump's endorsements of incumbents, 12 out of 12 won. And that's a pattern we've seen kind of with the former president, where he's gotten involved in races that are it's easy to be able to take credit for. In 7 open seats in Pennsylvania, the ones that won were safe seats, but the challenging races, they lost. Those people that were endorsed by the former president, there were 5 out of 6 that were lost. Out of the 114 competitive districts, and again, one of the problems in this country is that too many of our elections are really solved in primaries. That's a whole nother discussion on gerrymandering and redistricting and such. But out of the 114 competitive districts around the country, candidates that got Trump's endorsement underperformed their baseline by 5 points, and Republicans who were without Trump's blessing actually overperformed by 2.2 points, which is a pretty good difference when you consider how much weight the media has given Trump's endorsement and how much power he has or doesn't have in terms of his electoral prowess. If you look at the cycle, I think we can all feel better about this process, in that while we do have Arizona being litigated possibly, we did have some areas of confusion. We always are going to have areas of confusion in elections. But I have to think that the process won. Generally speaking, around the country, we can feel good. We haven't had a repeat of January 6th. We've had some arguments, we've had some debates, but the process actually did well in 2022. So I'd have to say that democracy was a winner. That we can have elections, we can elect, we can go through feel confident about the process, and we can feel good about where we are as a nation. Where I think all of us have had some concerns after looking at what happened in January 6th and what's transpired since then. I'd also have to suggest that while she lost her seat, Liz Cheney could be considered a winner, in that she gave up her own seat. We knew that was going to happen, but she got involved in some other races where the candidates that she got behind, some of whom were Democrats, won. Particularly if you look at the Arizona race where she got involved there. And then you got to give credit to Biden, although he's been much maligned in the first 2 years of his presidency. Only 2 presidents since World War II, which was JFK and then George W. Bush in 2002, have avoided losses in the Senate and held the House losses below 10 seats in their first midterm. And so that's a win. That's a win for Biden's presidency. And it may not say as much about Biden as it does about a lack of confidence necessarily in what they view the Republican alternatives are right now, which means both parties need to get their act together. I say that Biden won in this, and he did win, I guess, in the case of this cycle. But we also saw that 67% of those surveyed don't want Biden to seek a second term. Only about 30% of those surveyed want him to run again. So while it's a mixed bag for him and his agenda, and he'll face an uphill climb dealing with what will be a very interesting dynamic in the House with McCarthy as Speaker, Biden can at least claim success, and has and deservedly so. say all that to tell you that I think we've got a lot of serious challenges ahead, and I'm sure Ron will talk more about this just in terms of what kind of policy we can expect and look at both at a state and a federal level. We are very much divided in this country. We all know that. No one on this call thinks we're not. We're in camps now, whether it's, you're either for or against. There's no middle ground. And that's going to make it particularly difficult as we have all this tribalism in this country for policymakers, even at the local level, it seems, county councils, school boards, state legislatures, and Congress. So we hope that we can move forward and get back to a little bit of a, if you want to call it, norms and decency, where a middle ground can be found. It took forever to get a constitution, and it took forever to get a continental Congress to agree on things as we were forming this country. But it also took a word that some people believe is 4 letters, and it's not, and that word's compromise. But the more the voters understand that, then hopefully the more our elected officials will understand that. And we have to get past what I think is a real problem in terms of the political dynamic here in the United States, that the end justifies the means. I think you see that right now. Look at Georgia, for example. Most people would acknowledge that Herschel Walker is not the most qualified man or woman to be elected to the United States Senate, but it is a vote for the Senate. And there's a huge number of people in the state of Georgia that are interested in that vote for the Senate, whether or not he's uniquely qualified to be in that office or not. I'm someone who doesn't necessarily agree with much anything that Warnock stands for, but he is but seems to be a little bit more qualified at least. And then I go back, I mentioned this earlier, primary season. Fundamental problem in this country continues to be our primary system, continues to be the gerrymandering. We just went through a redistricting and lines have been redrawn. Until our elections are not decided in primaries, until our elections are actually decided in November, we will continue to see extreme left and extreme right candidates being elected at every level. And that is not indicative of what the general public seems to want. Consider this a call to action for those of you on this call to engage locally, to engage statewide, to engage federally, that we can try to get a better system of going through the primary process, so that we're not necessarily nominating the most extreme voices within each respective party. Those are the challenges that we have going forward. The next couple of months are going to be very interesting with the onset of a new Congress. Now you're going to have to answer another polling question here. So if you would, please take just a minute. Are you going to be making any changes in financing in the year ahead? And if you would, please go ahead and give your response. Give you a few minutes for that, 20 seconds or so. Thank you. And then I'm going to just leave it with this before we get. Certainly, you can send me an email, Chip@Felkel Group. Feel free to call me with any questions. But I would like for you to consider that with the new dynamic in general assemblies around the state and in Congress, you'll have immigration being back on the table. You'll probably have hearings about the Afghanistan withdrawal. You'll have hearings, God forbid, about the COVID-19 pandemic. You'll probably have hearings about DOJ and research at Mar-a-Lago. You'll hear the name Hunter Biden a whole lot. And last but not least, how does the 2024 presidential race then affect what gets done in Congress And will Trump be challenged by enough? Will Trump be challenged? And I think the answer to that now is yes. He's seen as being weakened, but is that not exactly what he wants? Please remember that the reason he got the nomination to begin with in 2016 was you had 12 or 13 different candidates running against him, and he was able to beat the crowd with a base of about 30% of the vote. That's a recap, and thanks for your time.
Thank you, Chip. A lot of very good information, and I think you've painted a picture correctly that as we now kind of begin to talk about the path forward, specifically around tax legislation, and I'll highlight some areas on what to pay attention to as well as what to expect. But I think Chip has painted the correct picture of what we see, not only in the lame duck section of the 117th Congress, but more specifically, as we talk about what to expect out of the 118th. So now that the Thanksgiving holiday is out of the way, it is time for year-end tax negotiations really to start heating up. And we obviously already begin to see that. So I would communicate to you that the Democrats and the Republicans have been about where tax legislation stands prior to year end. And I'll do a deeper dive in the considerations by them. But the work really began prior to the midterms and now continues post midterms as we approach, obviously, the December 31st date. But I'll tell you that there's a lot in flux. Specifically on the Democratic side, they still need to figure out what improvements to the child tax credit are at the top of their list in the negotiations with Republicans in the case that there can be a larger tax legislation deal made prior to year end. And we have a couple of avenues on how that could occur. But there's no question on the Democratic side, as well as on the Republican side, there is need for tax legislation prior to year end. And the check, if you will, in those negotiations are specifically on the Democratic side, the child tax credit, and specifically more on the Republican side, a couple key provisions, which I'll talk about. So that ultimately is not far from all. In the end, taxes are likely to be a supporting player for year-end drama. And I think there will be a lot of drama, as Chip has highlighted. So the broader bipartisan talks over a more ambitious government funding measure and other items will certainly influence what can get done on taxes. And so when we begin to think about, the drama and the rush towards December 31st, there's really three key dates in my assessment. The big date to remember is about 2.5 weeks away, December 16th, which is technically when the current round of government funding runs out. And the current deadline for, quote, appropriations score on a potential larger spending measure is due. So there are very active discussions going on, and taxes play a supporting role, as I mentioned, in those discussions. But that's the first date that's really critical. Now, to me, as Chip highlighted, we are a divided country. The Republicans did win the majority in the House, but by a much slimmer margin than what was really expected. I think Chip's analysis of the red wave becoming a red trickle or maybe even a drip is accurate. The whys and wherefores to all that, I think Chip did a good job in highlighting. But obviously, there's a tremendous amount of focus from a Senate side, not dissimilar, candidly, to what we saw previously in regards to the Georgia Senate runoff race, which will be December 6th. And so that one's really a key because, both parties will now know from their composition of what really the 118th Congress will look like. And, is the Senate truly controlled by the Democrats, or is there a potential of the divide being that, you're back to the 50-50 and then ultimately Vice President Harris weighing in on key provisions. So I think the majority of the view from the December 6th side is that there's a lot of money pouring in there from a Georgia perspective. But the real key date, as I mentioned, was the December 16th, because that is the first vehicle that is being looked at currently for potential tax legislation. And just as a reminder, here's what lawmakers are considering on the tax side, outside the improvement of the child tax credit and other priorities. But the immediate deduction for research cost and the more generous write-offs for interest on debt is where the Republicans are. So that's going to be the horse trading between the child tax credit, the repeal of some of the Tax Cuts Jobs Act of 2017, specifically the required capitalization of R&D, and then ultimately the 163J, as it's referred to, or the interest expense limitation. And I'll talk a little bit more. But there's further retirement security legislation, which also tops the tax writers as well as the negotiations as well. But it brings us to a polling question. So this is polling question number 3 for y'all. From your perspective, how do you see the economy performing over the next year? A bit better than expected, much better than expected, about what I anticipated, a bit worse than expected, or far worse than expected. All right, it's an interesting poll, and it was intentional because we saw GDP go to 2.9% from a growth perspective, and so that obviously caused the markets yesterday to react in a positive way, coupled with the announcements by the Fed that there's going to slow the interest rate increases down. So when we think about tax legislation, we have to consider all the variables that are specific. And so one thing I want to make sure that we focus on as well in the US is really looking overseas. This December might be really the last chance for a pretty sizable tax bill for quite a while, given the legislative gridlock that's expected to return with really a divided government in the 118th Congress. But when you think about looking overseas, because we have to take into consideration all these variables, there might be a scenario, and we could look at Brussels on this, where the EU finance ministers have really been eyeing a meeting in the next weeks for really trying to find a way to implement the 15% minimum tax on a global level. Now, you know that within the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, which was passed on August 16th, now we do have, in essence, a book income tax at 15%. But that's not an alignment of where the global piece is. The other variable that I would highlight before we dig into the tax legislation is actually the nomination of the commissioner. So we saw Danny Werfel get nominated. But there's really still no word on how soon the Senate Finance Committee specifically might be able to pick up Danny Werfel's nomination to be the next IRS commissioner. As we know, Chuck Reddick, the former commissioner, has been replaced with an interim, and then Danny was represented. I think Democrats have noted that at least some Republicans have had kind words about Werfel's, really just over a year and a half as the interim IRS chief. But lots of conservatives have less than fond memories of those 7 months when Danny was in place. And so, there's terms used like cover up to explain Werfel's tenure, in which the IRS was reviewing significant challenges around some partisan targeting, if you remember, when it came to policing nonprofits. So I mentioned that because those are variables that ultimately pay into the tax legislative path in 2022 over the remaining period of time. So I start with enhancing American retirement now and tie it into Security 2.0. So just some background here, because I think this is one of the pieces of legislation that we could see ultimately taken into account in December 16th, or potentially in the extender legislation, which I'll speak about. So several Washington insiders say that the package it's referred to as the retirement reform bills, known as One Secure 2.0, are really expected to be consolidated and passed sometime prior to end of year. There's, quote, bipartisanship support for that. So when you think about enhancing American retirement now, or what's being referred to as the EARNed Act, as well as the Retirement Improvement and Savings Enhancement to supplement healthy investments for the nest egg, which was referred to as the Rise and Shine Act. And then you have this Securing a Strong Retirement Act, or what's referred to as Secure 2.0. These were passed by Senate and or House. And really the inside line is that we expect that these three pieces of legislation, again, some passed by House, some passed by Senate, will ultimately be combined into one massive piece of retirement legislation. It'll probably come underneath the Enhancing American Retirement Now Act. And there's bipartisanship support for it. And the final bill will likely be attached, I believe, to what we'll see from a funding perspective prior to December 16th. There's really no large differences when you read the three bills, but I don't think any of the bills are any language in there is going to prevent the final passage, again, expected in December 16th. So again, I've already mentioned the key date of congressional funding. There's a lot there to be considered when you think about extending beyond. So make a long story short, let's talk about what I refer to as the shaky economic and physical outlook, which ultimately will require stable and some pro-growth tax policies. And so, you know, traditionally we have seen, you can go back to the prior slide. So traditionally we have seen each year policymakers facing a number of expiring tax provisions that are really, I'll say, typically extended on a temporary basis, which ultimately set up recurring and almost ritualistic tax extender seasons. So when we think about, you know, the tax legislative path, we know that the Democrats and Republicans have been working really pre-midterm elections towards some piece of tax legislation, whether that was going to be taking into account some of the Tax Cuts Jobs Act 2017 expiring tax provisions, as I've highlighted, the three bills that are really sitting up there that will be consolidated into one around the Enhancing American Retirement Now EARNs Act. But at a time of heightened concerns about our economy, as you polled at 40%, so you know why I put that poll in there, we've got high deficits, no question there's inflation. Policymakers are prioritizing trying to stabilize an economic growth by making permanent some of the pro-growth tax provisions, which actually were in the Tax Cuts Jobs Act of 2017, but are in fact expiring. So I would note to you that in 2021, there were no tax extender deals on numerous provisions which expired. So that work really began in the summer around some smaller policy matters or tax legislations that ultimately were going to build to what I call kind of the ritualistic tax extender session during sometime in the December front. And so ultimately, let me mention a couple of the key provisions. So first of all, bonus depreciation. That was a tax pro-growth provision which allows new and used assets to be immediately expensed underneath a provision called 168K. Again, a pro-growth from the standpoint. But when we look at bonus depreciation, in 2023, companies will only be able to deduct 80% of their investment in short-lived assets, with the remaining 20% spread. And then ultimately in 2024, that phases down in regards to 60%, and then in 2025, 40%. So that's one of those pro-growth drivers that was in the Tax Cuts Jobs Act that expired again January 1, 2023. We go to 80%. That is going to be another chit on the table that actually has bipartisanship support to be reinstated to 100%. I mentioned earlier that the Democrats need to, and this is very, you can read in the press, they need to figure out what they really want to do with the child tax credit, which was one of the most significant policies in what was referred to as ARPA, and actually the expansion of the refundable child tax credit. The full refundability of that child tax credit expired this year. And so the Democrats are very pro the child tax credit in regards to reinstating that and making sure that those refundability of the child tax credit is in fact reinstated. And that is likely to be the major chit, but they have not figured out in their caucus what they actually want. So that's one of those year-end provisions that everybody's paying attention to. I mentioned previously on the amortization of R&D expenses. So starting in the 22 tax year, again, an expiring provision in the Tax Cuts Jobs Act 2017, it requires companies to amortize the costs of their R&D investment over 5 years, where traditionally you were eligible to expense all of your research and experimentation or development expenses under 174 immediately, as well as obviously generating the research and development credit. So in essence, what's happening is it penalizes the R&D investment in the tax code. So in late 2021, there was actually a bipartisan interest in preventing this policy from ultimately going into effect. That was within the Build Back Better plan, which we know did not pass, and that ultimately turned into really some of the remnants of the Build Back Better became in the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. And I can tell you factually that the part of the July negotiations between Senator Manchin and Senator Schumer to pass the Inflation Reduction Act in August 16th was, and Manchin went to the mat as well as Senator Sinema went to the mat to ensure that that was pushed, and there was a commitment by Senator Schumer to in fact make sure that that provision was repealed. That ultimately did not happen. And that's why I would say that that is one of the things to pay attention to, because that's why that December 31st date is so important, because ultimately it really penalizes all of our, I'll say, defense contractors and really other manufacturers / technology developers. So when you think about an Apple and a Microsoft and Google and some of the other major, Fortune 100 companies that use that R&D, it's estimated that that will cost them about $29 billion if they do need, in fact, prior, based on what is in law now, have to capitalize all those. So that December 31st date becomes very important. I mentioned the limit on business interest expense. So that was one of these other expiring provisions. So we used to calculate the investment interest expense limitation attributable to EBITDA, or earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, amortization. And then of course we saw an expiration now to where you have to calculate that to EBIT, or earnings before interest and tax, and they dropped the add back of depreciation and amortization around that 30% limitation. That is a significant impact to taxpayers, and that is one of those expiring provisions that is expected from the Tax Cuts Jobs Act to be a major negotiation point. I already mentioned the child tax credit, will be the Democrats' major chip on the table of negotiations. And then I think what we'll see in the year-end extenders is what I just mentioned, is specifically bonus depreciation, specifically amortization of R&D, and specifically trying to make sure that EBITDA gets back in the statute. But that's not where it ends around year-end extenders. So again, what I called this ritualistic, or I've often used the term, it's the land of misfit toys, toys meaning tax legislative policies. So if you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, which again, there's been 3 pieces of major legislation, as we know. We saw the CHIPS Act, August 9th. We saw the Inflation Reduction Act passed August 16th, all very major pieces of legislation, really on top of the Investment, Infrastructure, and Jobs Act that was passed in 2021. But tax extenders that expired in 2021 that are going to need to be reset. And there is also, again, these negotiations occurring. When you think about what is called the credit for 2-wheel plug-in electrical vehicles, the mine rescue team training credit, which of course is near and dear to Senator Manchin's heart. You saw significant credit for production of what's referred to as Indian coal. There's also a number of provisions around the Indian employment credit, an increase in state low-income housing tax credit ceiling. That's now popped up as of last week as another piece that they want to discuss in the extenders. And then ultimately, you have some premiums in regards to what are called certain qualified mortgage insurance on qualified residence interests. So Congress has a lot to really get through in what I would call this ritualistic tax extender. So, your takeaways should be Democratic child tax credit is what they want. The Republicans want specifically the 3 areas I'd mentioned. And then above and beyond that, both are getting pressure from their constituents on the tax extenders that expired, but did not get included in the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. So before I go to the next slide, what really matters? That's really the question when you think about 2022 and all the year-end tax planning. And so I will tell you that due to what I view as arcane budget rules and limited floor time in Congress, they deal with certain items almost monolithically. And it's really important for Congress, when we think about these provisions and tax extenders, really to focus on, as I referred to, we have a shaky economy. Our physical outlook based on your polling is not positive, though we've seen in Black Friday and what is referred to as Monday, $20 billion of spending. And we're a consumer-driven economy. But the concern is our debt's out of control. And now what we see happening at the individual level is credit card debt is at a significant all-time high. So the budget resolution and really stabilizing the economy has got to be top of mind, whether it's on the Democratic side or the Republican side, if you will. So let's move to the next slide, and let me talk a little bit about the 118th Congress and what to expect. Chip did a nice job in regards to, the dynamics, the variables that occur and what ultimately became the red drip. Make a long story short, the 118th Congress is expected to be gridlocked. Whether you see the split in the Senate, the reality is you have a Democratic president, you'll have a House that in theory is under Speaker McCarthy, but remember that vote has not occurred and is to be next year. He has already rolled out the commitment to America, but he has a divided Republican caucus right now. In fact, there are some challenges, as you've probably seen, specifically out of Texas on the House side. And so when you really kind of look at how the House works, specifically in the majority side and how you become Speaker and some of the other senior leadership positions, it's likely that Kevin will ultimately be the Speaker of the House and the major pieces of his caucus will be there. But holding that caucus together, Kevin, the slim majority they have in the House, is going to be a very significant challenge for the Republicans. On the Senate side, if they, let's say, control, depending on the December 6th, which Chip spoke about, it is really a gridlocked Senate. So what is to be expected in the 118th Congress prior to the 2024 election? Gridlock. We often refer to the last months of a sitting Congress as the lame duck session, but what you're going to see is a lot of tax legislation occurring because, as I mentioned, we are going to really, this is their last chance. Now, Kevin's rolled out the commitment to America, and I would agree with Chip. There's going to be a lot of investigations, a lot of hearings. You're going to hear about Hunter Biden. You're going to hear about a lot of different things, but there are so many variables that really it is not expected from a tax legislation perspective that we're really going to see anything come in the 2023 or really prior to the 2024 election. And again, the December 6th, is it in stalemate? I think irregardless of what occurs on December 6th in the Georgia race, the answer is yes, the Senate is stalemated. I would say that a number of the commitments that Senator Schumer made, as well as to Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema, did not occur, specifically in some of the very specific energy provisions. And so, Senator Manchin, Senator Sinema have always kind of been, seen not necessarily aligned with the Democratic side. So you could see, some splits there. And because on the House side, it's so thin, and holding that Republican caucus together is going to be a real challenge. Ultimately, it all comes down to congressional funding. And as I mentioned to you, a shaky economy and Congress from a policy perspective trying to stabilize it through tax legislation really in this lame duck session, because I think the general view from an insider perspective on the Hill is that the 118th Congress is an interesting Congress if you begin to see who was elected, as Chip highlighted, but also it's going to be a very interesting situation. As you saw Speaker Pelosi step down, we have some new, what I would view as kind of minority leadership, and that'll be an interesting to see how that works in the House. And then obviously, as we know, Senator Schumer and Senator McConnell don't have really the best relationship from that standpoint. The next slide. So that brings us to polling question number 4. Are economic conditions going to alter your strategies looking ahead to 2023? Yes, no, or not sure? Yes, so that is not a surprise. It was intentional in this polling question. And so we have 40%, or really the majority, felt like the economy was worsening. And I think even though we saw positive gross domestic production, 2.9% growth, very nominal growth, but still at least a positive indicator, we are still in a very high inflation rate environment. And we have some global issues, as we know, that are going to impact the United States. And I mentioned just one in regards to the minimum tax from that perspective. So I hope you felt that the information I shared, to the extent, I have a crystal ball, or we have a crystal ball. I think I've given you really a good path forward and what to expect. I would pay close attention to the year-end provisions. I can tell you that there is a lot of back and forth between Senate Finance, House Ways and Means, whether that was old leadership or new leadership, in regards to ultimately what can be passed from that standpoint. And I did not mention, as we all know, there's a significant rail strike that is potential. Obviously, it passed the House. It's moved to the Senate, but the Senate Schumer has not indicated when that vote would occur. I think he's hoping he can get it done by no later than December 6th. But, if you shut down the rails, which would impact 40+% and a loss estimated at $29 billion a day, that's going to be very problematic. And I would also say, remember that of the 12 unions that agreed in the September timetable, 4 of the 12, which actually has the majority of individuals that work our rail lines, 4 of those voted against what was agreed to in the September timetable. So that's another economic variable to pay close attention to. So now I'll turn it over to our leader, Mark Cooter.
All right, thank you, Ron. Chip, I think we had one question in the chat. If you're still out there and available, maybe to take a look at that and maybe read the question and reply if you can.
Sure. I think the question was, we've always had primaries, and why they're more. I think the general question was, why do we have more issues with primaries? We've always had them, and why does that mean it's more of an extreme concern about primaries? And I would say a couple of things. Number one, no surprise, the onslaught of social media has ginned up people who look at issues, hardcore issues. The tendency, unfortunately, for elected leaders who are looking to get reelected in primaries, ginning up issues that aren't really for the broader public, but are more maybe even social issues, social concerns. And then, quite frankly, the general public doesn't participate in primaries like they should. Activists, extremists, hardcore ideologues tend to be the ones that make sure they vote in primaries. And so you get the result of the people who are more fervent about particular issues end up participating in primaries more so than the general public, general voting public, and the results speak for themselves.
Okay, thanks, Chip. Well, that concludes our session today. Thank you again for joining us, and a big thanks to both Chip and Ron for their insights today. If you have any questions, please reach out to us at any time. You can see Ron and Chip's contacts on these slides, as well as just reach out to Cherry Bekaert. We'll be happy to answer any questions. We do value your feedback and ask you that you take part in a short survey, which will appear when you leave this session. And thanks for everyone's time today.